Samuel Hart, a 79-year-old African-American veteran, walked through the streets of his quiet neighborhood like he had countless times before. But there was a certain rhythm to his steps, deliberate and measured, each one reflecting the weight of decades gone by. His posture, slightly stooped from age and a lingering injury from the Korean War, spoke of endurance rather than frailty. The faint drag of his right leg was a small but persistent reminder of the battlefields he had once traversed, a permanent memento of a time when survival meant facing the impossible every single day. Yet, even with his slight hunch and slowed gait, there was something unmistakable about Samuel's presence. His very being radiated a quiet pride and strength that couldn't be diminished by time. It was in the way his shoulders remained squared, his chin slightly raised as if defying the years that had passed. His military jacket, though old and worn, added to this air of dignity. The patches and insignias sewn onto it were faded but well-maintained, each stitch meticulously cared for. To Samuel, this jacket wasn't merely clothing. It was a symbol, a badge of honor that told the story of his sacrifices, his service, and his enduring spirit. Samuel's relationship with that jacket was deeply personal. Each patch represented a chapter of his life, a memory forged in the crucible of duty and survival. It wasn't just a reminder of his time in Korea, but also of the battles he had fought at home. A man who had served a country that didn't always recognize his worth. The jacket carried a weight far heavier than its fabric, a weight Samuel bore with silent resilience every day. The morning sun hung low in the pale blue sky, casting long, golden shadows over the neighborhood. The air was crisp and fresh, carrying with it the faint scent of dew from the previous night. Samuel's steps were steady as he made his way toward the corner store, the comforting familiarity of his routine guiding him. He had been visiting this store for years, its slightly peeling paint and faded brick walls as much a part of his morning as the coffee he drank. As he approached, the bell above the door jingled, its cheerful sound marking his arrival. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming, with shelves neatly stocked and the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. "Good morning, Mr. Hart." Tom, the young store clerk, greeted him enthusiastically. Tom was a kind soul, always ready with a smile and a word of respect for Samuel. The older man nodded in acknowledgement, a faint but genuine smile breaking across his face. Samuel didn't need much, just his usual cup of coffee and a small pastry. He liked the simplicity of it. In these small, quiet moments, the world seemed to slow down, allowing him to breathe, to think, to feel the presence of time in a way that wasn't rushed or hurried. For Samuel, it was a brief but cherished pause in the busyness of life. With his coffee and pastry in hand, Samuel stepped back outside. The cool morning air greeted him like an old friend, and he took a deep breath, savoring the tranquility of the neighborhood. The streets were calm, punctuated only by the distant hum of a passing car or the occasional chirping of birds. It was a peaceful corner of the city, one where people knew each other by name, where familiarity bred comfort. Samuel had been a part of this community for decades, and though many of its younger residents didn't know the full story of his life, they respected him. To them, he was the kind old veteran with the dignified air, a man who had seen more than most but carried himself with quiet humility. But as Samuel walked, sipping his coffee, a subtle sense of unease began to creep into his mind. He couldn't explain it, but something about the day felt off. Perhaps it was the sharpness of the light filtering through the trees, or the faint chill in the air that didn't seem to match the season. Whatever it was, it settled in his chest like a distant, nagging memory trying to resurface. Samuel's instincts, honed from years of service in the Korean War, told him to stay alert. Those instincts had saved his life more times than he cared to count, and even now, decades later, they hadn't dulled. There was a tension in the air that he couldn't quite place, a feeling he knew better than to ignore. As he continued down the sidewalk, his thoughts drifted to the past. He remembered the frozen fields of Korea, the relentless cold that had seeped into his bones, the deafening roar of artillery fire that had been a constant backdrop to his days. Surviving the war had been a battle in itself, but coming home had presented its own challenges. Samuel had returned to a country that viewed him with suspicion and prejudice, a black man in a segregated America. Even in the military, he had faced discrimination, often being given the most dangerous and thankless tasks simply because of the color of his skin. The battles he had fought on the home front were no less grueling than those he had faced abroad, and the scars they left were just as deep. And yet, Samuel had carried himself with dignity through it all. It was the only way he knew to fight back, not with anger or bitterness, but with quiet strength. It was how he had survived, how he had endured. Now, as he turned a corner, the faint sound of an engine caught his attention. His eyes landed on a police patrol car parked idly near the curb. The sight of it sent a ripple of unease through him. It wasn't unusual to see police cars in the neighborhood, but something about this one felt different. The tension he had been feeling all morning seemed to sharpen, coiling tight in his chest. Years of experience had taught Samuel not to ignore these feelings, but he also knew better than to let them dictate his actions. He adjusted his grip on his cane, straightened his shoulders, and kept walking. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had nothing to fear, or so he told himself. But the unease lingered, heavy and insistent, a quiet reminder that some battles never truly end. As Samuel turned the corner, the patrol car idling by the curb caught his eye again. Though he tried to ignore it, something about its presence felt intrusive, unsettling. He adjusted his grip on his cane, keeping his gaze forward and his pace steady. He reminded himself that he had done nothing wrong. This was his neighborhood, his home, but the weight of his instincts told him otherwise. Years of experience, both on the battlefield and in the face of prejudice, had taught him that unease was never to be dismissed lightly. The man sitting inside the patrol car was Officer Kyle Baxter, a young officer barely in his late 20s. Though new to the force, Baxter had already gained a reputation, and not the good kind. Known for his brash demeanor and short temper, particularly toward minorities, Baxter embodied a dangerous mix of arrogance and authority. His family's long-standing ties to law enforcement had instilled in him a sense of invincibility, a belief that his badge gave him license to act without accountability. Baxter's sharp blue eyes scanned the street lazily until they landed on Samuel. Something about the sight of the old man, his military jacket, his slow but deliberate gait, made Baxter's jaw tighten. In that moment, he didn't see a veteran or a man of honor. He saw only assumptions, shaped by prejudice and fueled by arrogance. Leaning forward, Baxter grabbed the loudspeaker. His voice crackled through the still morning air, sharp and dripping with condescension. "Where do you think you're going, old man?" The sudden interruption startled Samuel. He stopped mid-step, his grip tightening on his cane as the words echoed around him. The tone was all too familiar. It carried the weight of a lifetime of similar encounters, moments when his dignity had been challenged simply because of the color of his skin. He closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself before continuing forward without responding. Unsatisfied with the lack of reaction, Baxter's frustration flared. He stepped out of the car, his movements slow and deliberate, designed to intimidate. The clang of the car door shutting echoed down the quiet street as he strode toward Samuel, his boots crunching against the pavement. "Hey, old man," Baxter called again, his tone sharper now. "I'm talking to you. What are you doing walking around here like you own the place?" Samuel stopped, his back straightening slightly as he turned to face the young officer. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried a firm resolve. "I'm just heading home," he said evenly. "Is there a problem, officer?" Baxter smirked, mistaking Samuel's composure for weakness. He took a step closer, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the older man. "The problem is people like you thinking you can just walk around here like you belong." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. Years of enduring such treatment had taught him not to react, not to give them the satisfaction. But deep down, a simmering anger began to stir, a quiet defiance born from decades of injustice. Baxter's eyes flicked to Samuel's jacket, the faded patches and insignias catching his attention. His smirk widened as he gestured toward it. "That jacket of yours," he sneered. "Where'd you get it? A thrift store?" Samuel's voice remained steady, though his grip on his cane tightened. "I earned this jacket," he said simply. Baxter let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. Sure you did. Maybe you handed out water to the real soldiers, or cleaned up after them. That's about all someone like you could do. A small crowd had begun to gather nearby, drawn by the commotion. Neighbors, passers-by, people who had known Samuel for years. They stood in quiet disbelief, their expressions a mix of anger and unease. Phones were raised, cameras quietly recording the unfolding scene. Samuel held his ground, his voice calm but firm. I served my country, he said. That's all you need to know. For a brief moment, Baxter's smirk faltered. Something about Samuel's quiet dignity seemed to unsettle him, as if he couldn't quite grasp the strength behind the older man's composure. But the moment passed quickly, and Baxter, determined to reassert his authority, reached out and grabbed Samuel's arm. The crowd gasped, their murmurs growing louder. Hey, let him go, a young man shouted, stepping forward. His voice was filled with anger and conviction. He hasn't done anything wrong. Another voice joined in. Show some respect. He's a veteran. The energy in the crowd shifted, their collective outrage bubbling to the surface. Baxter's grip on Samuel tightened briefly, his expression darkening as he realized the situation was slipping out of his control. Before he could respond, another patrol car pulled up to the scene. Out stepped Sergeant Angela Carter, a commanding presence who exuded both authority and calm. A middle-aged black woman with years of experience on the force, Carter's sharp gaze immediately assessed the situation. She approached with a deliberate stride, her voice cutting through the noise with quiet power. Officer Baxter, she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. Step away from Mr. Hart. Baxter hesitated, his jaw tightening in frustration. For a moment, he seemed to consider defying the order, but the weight of Carter's authority was undeniable. Reluctantly, he released Samuel's arm and took a step back, his expression sullen. Carter turned to Samuel, her voice softening. Are you all right, sir? Samuel nodded, his voice steady despite the tension. I am now, he said simply. The crowd erupted into cheers and shouts of support, their voices rising in unison. Thank you, Sergeant, someone called. Others began to applaud, their phones still recording every moment. Carter addressed the crowd, her tone resolute. What happened here today was unacceptable, she said, her voice carrying over the noise. We owe Mr. Hart and every member of this community the respect they deserve. Officer Baxter's behavior does not reflect the values of this department, and there will be consequences. As Baxter was escorted back to his patrol car, the crowd's energy shifted from anger to unity. Strangers approached Samuel, offering words of gratitude and respect. The tension of the moment began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of solidarity and shared purpose. Samuel, though tired, stood tall. His dignity remained intact, untouched by the events of the morning. As he began to make his way home, surrounded by newfound allies, he couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. For a lifetime, he had carried the weight of prejudice alone. But today, for the first time in a long time, he felt truly seen. Samuel walked slowly back toward his home, the events of the morning still fresh in his mind. The neighborhood felt different now, charged with an energy he hadn't felt in years. The murmurs of the gathered crowd lingered in the background, fading gradually as he moved further away. Though his body ached from the tension of the encounter, his spirit remained unbroken. He glanced down at his worn military jacket, his fingers brushing over the faded insignias stitched into the fabric. This jacket had seen him through battles both on and off the battlefield. It was a symbol of his resilience, of his life's work, and of the sacrifices he had made for a country that had often treated him as invisible, or worse, as a threat. The neighborhood streets, once quiet and familiar, seemed alive with whispers of change. People he had known for decades nodded respectfully as he passed. Some stopped him to shake his hand or offer words of support. "We've got your back, Mr. Hart," a young man said, his voice steady and full of conviction. Samuel offered him a small but genuine smile. As he neared his home, he paused for a moment to look around. The sun was higher in the sky now, its golden light casting long shadows on the pavement. Children played down the street, their laughter a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the air earlier. Life moved on, as it always did. But Samuel knew this day would not be forgotten. Not by him, not by the community, and certainly not by Officer Baxter. Inside his modest home, Samuel settled into his favorite armchair by the window. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. The walls were adorned with photographs and mementos from his past. Black and white snapshots of his younger self in uniform, a folded flag in a glass case, and a collection of medals that glinted faintly in the sunlight. He let out a deep sigh, his gaze drifting to the small coffee table in front of him. The morning's events replayed in his mind, each moment etched with vivid clarity. Baxter's sneer, the crowd's outrage, and Sergeant Carter's commanding presence. All of it had unfolded so quickly, yet it felt like time had slowed to a crawl in those tense moments. Samuel's thoughts turned to the past, to the many times he had faced similar prejudice. Memories surfaced unbidden. Being turned away from a diner after returning home from the Korean War, facing suspicion and hostility while wearing the uniform of a country he had risked his life for, and enduring countless indignities simply for existing in a world that saw his skin color before it saw him. But today had been different. Today, the community had stood with him. The voices of strangers, young and old, black and white, had risen in unison to defend him. It was a moment of unity he hadn't expected but deeply appreciated. The sound of a knock at the door pulled Samuel from his thoughts. He pushed himself up from the chair, his movements slow but deliberate. When he opened the door, he was greeted by Sergeant Angela Carter. She stood there in her uniform, her expression warm but serious. "Mr. Hart," she began, her voice steady, "I wanted to check on you personally and let you know that Officer Baxter has been suspended pending an investigation. What happened today was unacceptable, and I promise you, we're taking it seriously." Samuel nodded, his expression calm. "Thank you, Sergeant. I appreciate you stepping in when you did." Carter hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "You've been through more than anyone should have to endure," she said finally. "But your strength, your dignity, it's inspiring. And I want you to know that people like me are here to make sure this kind of behavior doesn't go unchecked." Samuel studied her for a moment before replying. "I've seen a lot in my time, Sergeant. And while today was difficult, it gave me hope. Hope that things can change, even if it's just a little at a time." After she left, Samuel returned to his chair by the window, the weight of the day settling over him like a heavy blanket. Yet, for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone in carrying that weight. The support of his community, the determination in Carter's voice, and the quiet strength he had seen in the faces of those who had come to his defense, all of it filled him with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in years. The evening came, casting the neighborhood in hues of amber and gold. Samuel watched as the streets slowly emptied, the quiet returning like an old friend. He sipped his coffee, his mind turning to the future. He thought of the children playing down the street, their laughter echoing in his memory. He thought of the young man who had stepped forward to defend him, his voice steady and unyielding. Samuel knew the fight for justice wasn't over. It never truly was. But today had shown him that he wasn't fighting alone anymore. His story, his resilience, had sparked something in the people around him. And as he sat there, bathed in the fading light of the day, he felt a quiet but undeniable sense of pride, not just in himself, but in the community that had stood with him. For decades, Samuel had carried the weight of his experiences alone. But now, as the shadows stretched long across the pavement outside his window, he realized that the burden was a little lighter. He was no longer just a solitary figure walking the streets of his neighborhood. He was a symbol of strength and unity, a reminder that even in the face of prejudice, dignity and resilience could prevail. And for the first time in a long time, Samuel Hart felt truly at peace.